house tonight. As Pastor Steve gives your word, let it touch their hearts, Lord Jesus. Pray, Lord Jesus, that a new generation of believers comes out of there on fire for you, Lord Jesus. They have such an opportunity to impact their schools, and they are the voice inside their schools that they attend. Let all the adults be very supportive who are there, Lord Jesus. Just lift them up to you, Lord Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I want to talk about the parable of the sower today. And I had a particular topic that I want to drive home. It's particularly what ground are you in? I look at this, and there's a time when it's Matthew 13. We'll start verse 8. I used to, when I read this, I applied it I didn't think of applying it to different areas of my life. I just thought of it as me, as an individual, and that was it. I didn't really consider when Jesus is telling this parable about the seed, and the seed being the word, of how am I applying the word of God to all aspects of my life. And when I sit back and I examine myself, there's obvious areas where I am applying what I read in the Word better than in other areas of my life. Just as an example, from a financial perspective, you may be applying the Word and what the Word says concerning tithing and giving and offering. You may be doing that right to the letter, and it's great, and God's prospering for it. But maybe in the area of your devotional life, maybe it's slacking. It's not quite what would be considered the good ground or soil that it could be. So, really the biggest thing I want us to draw from this tonight is really break down what can I improve on in my life to draw me closer to the Lord in perspective of these particular grounds that Jesus is talking about here in this parable. So I'll start in verse 8. Jesus said, it starts in verse 4, my fault. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places, where they did have not much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Verse 7, and some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up, choked them. But others fell on good ground, and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, as you go on to read, the disciples wasn't understanding what Jesus was meaning by this. So as you go over verse 18, he actually spells it out for them, what this means. So in verse 18, Jesus says, therefore hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom, does not understand it, then the wicked one comes, snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who has received the seed by the wayside. Let me sit down. Sit down. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. But he who receives seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. I'm going to really use myself as an example of this, kind of give a personal testimony of how this parable applied in my own life, and then y'all can take it and start applying the same principles that Jesus is trying to teach here. One quick note, this parable is also found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. It's also found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8. All three are very identical in how this is described. Matthew is just sort of the most detailed of the bunch. So we've got three accounts of this. Why am I projecting that and letting you know that? It was obviously important. I find this, anytime you find some of Jesus' parables in more than one gospel, more than one writer found it necessary to include it in his book, it stands out to you as far as a parable in and of itself. That three of the gospel writers all wound up telling this particular parable Jesus gave them. I got saved when I was 14. And that was my real initial hearing of the word as far as me paying attention, and I was there expecting to hear something that would maybe change my life. I was at a Billy Graham crusade at the RCA though. We kind of went out of the blue, so to speak. We didn't prepare for it. I had parents who grew up in, I'll say, a Christian home in a sense. If they went to church when they felt like going to church, was kind of the home. My mother's family was predominantly Catholic. There's quite a few of them devoted Catholics. So my dad's mom was a devoted Pentecostal, but they didn't attend church regularly per se. So the home atmosphere I grew up in pretty much as a kid was kind of, my parents didn't shun religion or going to church or anything like that, but they definitely weren't doing a whole lot to see that I got there either. So we just found out that my dad always had a big love for Billy Graham. We found out he was coming to Indianapolis. Of course, the crusades are free. Most of them were, at least they were then, so we just packed up and went. I had no particular expectation that evening. But I was a sports fanatic. I was a junkie about sports. Still am for the most part. And it just so happened that night that the word that Mr. Grant presented was about running the race to win the prize. It was a very, oddly enough, a very kind of sports intertwined message he gave that night. And of course he wrapped it up about Jesus and the cross. But I mean, he had my attention from the very beginning of that message that night. And we were only talking about 25 minutes, maybe they preached. And I mean, by the time he was done, I had my mind made up. I was going up there, and I was receiving this Jesus that he was talking about. That I had some exposure to, but that was just different. The word he gave, when it talks about getting in your heart, the word that Mr. Graham gave that day got in my heart. it fell in here and it began to take root in here for the first time. Even more importantly, I feel like, was an encounter I had when I went up to receive Christ. Okay, when I went up front, Mr. Graham stepped back to pray. Okay, as people were coming forward, and he was in his 70s at this time. Okay, so he had a podium back there, and he had a bar stool, and he just kind of sat on the bar stool and was praying. And there was this aurora of light just glowing off. I can't explain it. It was one of the most supernatural things I'd ever seen. And he was so at peace. There was just this peacefulness over him. It was amazing. And that really, I remember that and recall that just as much as the word that was given. And it was that occurrence that really drew me into thinking this must be real. Okay, what he talked about tonight, there's something to it that I've never seen or experienced before, because I've never seen anything like that. So I would say pretty immediately into my relationship with God, considering my age, I took it seriously. I was quite devoted to my Bible reading. One thing I'd say I lacked a lot, though, was prayer. But neither, this ain't to blame anybody for it, neither did I really have anybody really stressing that to me, though, either. It wasn't necessarily anything from the pastor I had for the first couple of years that was really stressed. You know, it was mentioned kind of casually, and then we went on to something else. If there was something I feel like I could point back to early in my walk with God that would have helped this seed take root better in various areas of my life, it would have been prayer. The better stress I could put on that. I was a real, I like getting knowledge from people. I enjoyed, even as a teenager, sitting down with people 20 years older than me and hearing their stories. I want to know why they believed what they believed, how they got to where they were, why they were a Christian, how they became a Christian. I soaked that stuff up. I really enjoyed sitting down with Pastor Cooper, and he did a lot of missions trips, him and his wife to Guatemala. Spent a lot of time over there. I loved hearing those stories. I'll say this, there wasn't a Sunday that went by that you weren't going to hear a Guatemala story in his sermon at some point, you know. He's a very passionate man as far as evangelism and caring for the poor and such. One of the traps, and I actually brought this up to the men a couple weeks ago, that I felt like that I fell into was really the glamorizing of Christians. I started attaining this idea as I started approaching graduating from high school. So I'm about 4 years into my walk with God, that the sign of a good Christian or a faithful Christian, the sign of a Christian, as we read here, that's in the good ground, is the guy that God's propping up and putting in front of a bunch of people. And to some degree, we were entering a time as far as our culture where the internet was booming and stuff, so you could get a lot of outside opinion. Of course, it's doubled now. It ain't nothing. We've exacerbated that over the last 10, 15 years. But even when I was a teenager, you can get a lot of outside sources feeding you a lot of information that wasn't necessarily the truth or real. So I began to develop in my early 20s the idea that God's sign of really having his hand on somebody, God's sign, the sign you see in somebody who is rooted in good ground, is somebody that God's really propelling in front of people. It's somebody that God's given a lot of influence to. As I've gotten older, of course, I acknowledge that wasn't so much the case, but one of the things it started doing to me is I felt like it really started putting me as a person inside the ground that's talked about that was among the thorns. Because I really, instead of keeping my eyes on Christ, instead of staying focused on what it was that Jesus was specifically drawing me to do, my eye was constantly on other people. And what Jesus was doing with other people, and how can I be that person, more so than letting God develop me. And then everybody who's been in church long enough can probably testify to this, but stuff happens. Stuff happens in life, and you see stuff in the church you're in as well. Okay, let's face it, not everybody in the church with is always the best Christian all the time. Okay, that ain't pointing the finger at any one person, because we've all, the biggest thing I hope we get out of this is we all have work to do. There's always areas that we can be improving upon. But I had in my mind, I started letting the ups and downs of other people start dictating to me how willing I was going to be to let God do whatever it is that he decided for me. So I really, there in my early 20s, fit the man in that ground that was among the thorns. And I started letting the actions of people who called themselves Christians that wasn't necessarily, and I'll say, I wasn't around at that time. I wasn't surrounding myself. And this is something we all need to be very aware of. Who you surround yourself with. I was not surrounding myself around solid Christian men and women. The people that I primarily associated with outside of services on Sunday, this was the church I was attending at the time as a young adult. I didn't hang with the people here outside of church on Sunday. I had, to be frank, I played in bar bands and stuff, and I hung around very secularized Christians that they had their life and they had their Christian life, and they were two separate things. And I started surrounding myself around a lot of that, and you will become what you surround yourself with eventually. It might take time, which it did. I mean, it's not like this happened overnight with me where I was thriving and really growing. When I first started coming to this church, it was good for me. I grew up, for 4 years I had spent time in a very kind of conservative, you didn't see any action of the Holy Spirit in those churches. Being my dad's, the first one I went to, that was going on here. So when I came here, this was just a complete different scenery for me. Now, one thing it did was it did ignite something inside of me to explore, okay? Why and how is all this spiritual manifestation going on? God doesn't just do these things with people that's supernatural unless they are falling in line with what God is telling us in His Word to do. So my first couple of years here was really motivated for me. I really fed off the group here. But it's just, Satan has his way of baiting you if you're not watchful. One of the big things we're talking about there, when everything brought up, when everything gets at peace, then something happens. And you're right about that, because we stop being watchful. We let our guards down. So we can easily start letting people into our lives that start becoming thorns for us. That's exactly what happened. And I let one thorn in after another thorn after another thorn, and then before I know it, every area of my life has a thorn stuck in it. And I'm getting choked. And the more you let those people, the further those thorns drive into you, and the more choked, and the more choked, and the more choked you start getting. Until that thorn eventually becomes the dominating factor in your life. You're no longer in a position of being able to produce any fruit because you're bleeding. You can't be of help to anybody when you need to assess yourself. And then I started breaking the law, and I started making excuses as to why it was okay. And the best thing that ever happened to me was going to jail, going to prison. It was God's way of getting my attention, of saying, you have anybody that's around me that will tell you this. I knew the Bible, because in all this time, I was still a devoted word reader. I was inside this church every time it was open. I was up on this worship team. I mean, if you would have just sort of assessed my life on what you saw when the doors of this church were open, you probably would have thought I was fine. Unless you happened to be somebody who knew me more on a personal level. But that's another thing I hope to really encourage everyone in here tonight, is find you somebody. I'm not saying you got to be that way with everybody, but find you somebody to really pour into. Okay, it's important, especially in older men. We've had a kind of an influx of younger men come in here. So the more that you can pour in your ups and your downs, your good decisions, your bad decisions, the more you can pour that into them, hopefully, they'll learn from it. And you can eventually also become somebody that they begin feeling trustworthy and that you can lean on. I started suffering from that. But one person I was real close to when I started coming here was Clayton. And Clayton got busy with his wife. Him and Beth had their third child, and they had their fourth child, and he was a busy man. I saw that, and I knew that. He still is a busy guy, to be honest with you. So I kind of lost my niche guy there. Now at the same time, I'll say people need to learn to stand themselves, though. Okay. And as you're kind of coming along somebody, you need to make that clear to them that you're there for them, you're there to speak into their lives, you're there to help them grow, but they've got to learn to let this word get rooted in themselves without you being right alongside them all the time. We all at some point have to learn how to grow in God as just ourselves, without anybody's help. There's going to be times when we see all throughout the Bible where God left people alone. Now, one of the things we also see is growth during this time. Jesus grew when he was out in the wilderness for 40 days. Overall, Elijah being away, having ravens feed him, growing closer to God. The times when we're alone, and also if we will cultivate that time, could be a real time of growing in the Lord for us. And ultimately, that's what my prison time was. That was God getting me alone by myself. Strange atmosphere, to say the least. But I knew what my problem was. Okay, which is important. You've got to be willing to admit what it is that you need to yank and pull out and get rid of, and what you need to plug in to replace it. And I knew the biggest thing that I feel like I needed to do in regards to what this parent was talking about was I needed to reestablish my root system. My root system was clogged. So I just started feeding myself. I got a hold of any book. I read through this Bible front and back. I became a more avid Bible reader, and I didn't look at my word reading as just being some sort of chore that a good Christian does. I took on an attitude of when I read the Word, I not only want to learn and gain understanding from God when I read it, but I want to say, after I'm done reading this Word, that it has drawn me closer to the Lord than what I was prior to it. Every day when you read it, that ought to be a hope or an expectation for us that we knew less prior to going into the Word than we do after we read it. I found literature. We had access to a library at the jail. It's kind of small. At the jail, honestly, which is where I initially started my time off of, it was really just a lot of Bible reading. I really didn't get into finding literature to read until I got to the prison. They had a chapel library there. They had a regular library. And there was a lot of good books. There was ministers I liked who I knew spoke good, sound truth. I found their books. I read them. I started digging for other guys that I knew those ministers had association with, but I maybe never read them. I knew Tony Evans, for example, had contacts with Jim Simlin. So I started picking up some of Jim Simlin's books, and I would do things like that. I'd kind of figure out what ministers mingled with who, and I would typically find commonalities in their books, but you would find neat little differences, though. Just for an example, Jim Simlin is a white man whose church is in downtown Brooklyn, so he's got a totally different field that he's having to harvest and cultivate than Tony Evans is. He's a black man. He's in Dallas, Texas. Just two different cultures. And if you hear them give their testimony, you hear the different people groups that they're having to minister to and such. Tony Evans is a real advocate about the black youth. And I really like that a lot. has their urban alternative ministry that they fund a lot. And it's real geared towards developing the African American youth into fine young adults that will turn into godly men. Teach them how to be good fathers. So by the time I got out of prison, I read a good 20 to 30 books in that time frame. Now we're talking about 14 months. So I would read through one, I'd get another. I just soaked it up. And God talked to me. It was like that time I was alone. I was in an environment that most people would think, how could you grow in the Lord in an environment such as a prison? Well, if you'll devote yourself, and if you will seize an opportunity and realize, okay, I'm here due to choices I've made, but I can still take advantage of this time to begin whatever it is I need to start doing to reverse these choices and start pressing on towards the future. Because what happened. Okay, there's no reversing that. Okay, and I was sort of more in a fortunate position where I didn't hurt a lot of people along the way. But it's something I deal with in my prison ministry. There's a lot of men where I'm becoming their only advocate. It burned a lot of bridges with people. So once I got out, I felt, honestly, the last thing I wanted to do was jump into doing any kind of ministry. Because me and Tabitha got married shortly before I went to prison. We'd only been married like 8 months before I went to prison. My son was like 11 months old. I'd only got to see my son every now and again during visitation. So my primary focus when I got out was just my family. That's really all I was concerned about, was connecting. That was my next ground that I felt like I needed to cultivate. I'd had my time alone start cultivating my heart and letting this word, this seed really grow in my heart, take root, really grab a hold of me, start really begin to transform my mind and my approach in life, not with people, just everything. Opportunities that may arise, what's God's thoughts about it came first, as opposed to what's Robert want to do. That's how I got. That was my nature prior to going to prison. It became what does Robert want? How's this going to benefit Robert? Is this going to give me a leg up? Is this going to make Robert look better? It was all about me, and it became all about me. And I was around a lot of people who were all about themselves also. So that was another big thing when I got out, was people assessing. You could tell very quickly in a few conversations with somebody, and I've really had to apply this doing prison ministry. Is this person still thinking from a mindset of how everything benefits them, or are they really reaching out? And are they really understanding and realizing that they've got to make a change, and only God's going to be able to produce the change that they want? Whether it's getting off drugs, getting off alcohol, or very simply just not breaking the law anymore. So those were the two immediate fields when I got out of prison that I really worked on. I need to be applying the word into my family life. That was a new field that I needed to take on and see that the word and the seed that's described here, that I cultivated a good ground within my family for that to grow. If I was going to be the man of God I needed to be for my wife, for my son, it wasn't going to happen if a bunch of thorns start getting in there. Okay? Or if I get ahead. This is an example what I mean, like get ahead. Say I would have jumped right into ministry, which I had opportunities. I had people asking me right when I got out to do stuff. And I said no to it. Got it? Yeah. Okay. If I would have jumped right in that, I'll finish up today's lesson on the parable of the sower by saying that we need to always be evaluating the ground we're in. As I was about to mention there, while we were in the service, as I almost immediately got out of prison, the first thing I started getting asked about almost immediately was starting up jail and prison ministry. And the timing wasn't right. It's a good cause. It's something that I definitely could have went into and did, but the time wasn't right for it. So the seed that would have been sown into that ministry at that time wouldn't have had any long sustaining fruit to it. At that time in my life, my particular focus, as I've mentioned, was my family and son. Getting too involved in ministry was not on my radar at all, and I knew that it wasn't time to be doing that either. So we always need to be evaluating such things. What kind of ground different areas of our life are in? How can we improve upon it? And then, even when it comes to ministry, is the time right to be sowing seed into that ministry, whatever it may be? Jail and prison ministry did not start becoming a factor in my life as far as me actually beginning to start doing such until about 6 years, 5 to 6 years. Well, it was back in, I'll put it this way, back in July of 2015 was when I started. I was writing guys and stuff prior to that, so, there was a little bit of kind of dunking in it some, but as far as going completely, okay, this is something I want to do, I'm going to be spending time doing this and devote time for it. Yes, it wasn't until July of last year that I made that decision to start actually doing that. Always be evaluating, always be looking and evaluating what kind of ground am I growing in. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. God bless.